countdown and then you just begin.
I am here today with Richard Hanania, author of The All-New Origins of Woke. Probably, if you're watching, you know something about him. There's the book. Nice cover. I've been talking to Richard about this stuff for a few years. We're going to go over a lot of the main ideas of the book, but especially we're going to go over the parts I would really want to talk about. So let's get started. One of your most famous pieces, I think, in fact, it's still your most read piece, is just the one on the left cares more.
Yeah.
So can you remind us what you said in that piece?
Yeah. So just liberal people, I mean, in general, have more of a sort of a critical mass of people who care about politics. So if you look at sort of donations, although the donations thing isn't always consistent, it sort of varies. It's varied more in the recent past. But if you look at other things like protesting is more consistent advantage for the left. You look at signing like a petition.
Or how about cutting off friends and family over politics, right?
That too, yes, indeed. And then I think a big piece of evidence is just being willing to go into relatively low-paying, high-influence professions like journalism and academia. And most people who succeed in those fields tend to be very smart and could make a lot of money in finance or something like that. Well, maybe not all of them, but some of them.
Right.
Finance.
Right now, so a lot of people read that piece and they got a quite different picture of wokeness than you present in the book. A lot of people read that and just say, okay, that's what's going on. It's that woke people care more and they just are going to get their way regardless. And it's got really nothing to do with law. It has to do with the intensity of preference. But then you did a follow-up piece called Wokeness is Just Civil Rights Law, if I remember the title correctly.
Woke institutions is just civil
rights.
Yes,
yeah, woke institutions is just civil rights law. And this one, you take a view that at least a lot of people who read the first piece are going to have a very different, are going to see it as a big change, because this is the one where you really said that under civil rights law, you almost have to be woke. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the wokeness is a very powerful thing. It took over every society. They speak on, with one voice on sensitive issues and major news events. So it's, something that has that much, something that is that powerful is usually going to have a lot going for it. So it's not going to be monocausal. But they sort of they reinforce each other because who influences the law? People who care more. And so the law then influences institutions and shapes the incentive structure people face. So there's like, we have to sometimes break down this thing of wokeness, what we're talking about. Well, I notice I called it woke institutions as just civil rights law. So I've been talking to people in France and the UK, and I ask them, are institutions as woke in your country as they are in the US? Do they make statements on hot button issues related to race or gender or anything like
Companies,
that?
right?
And they tend to say no. And so this tends to be a particularly American phenomenon where the institutions themselves are very woke. I think civil rights goes a long way to explain that. And then, liberals caring more also explains a lot too.
Right now, if you let me ask a narcissistic question, I liked your first piece a lot. That's what got you on my radar. But then I had a reply saying, look, it's totally sensible to say the left cares more, but this can't really explain the sheer uniformity of what's going on. So I had a piece called The Missing Right-Wing Firms. And I said, look, there's still a lot of right-wing people out there who would like to be at a place that wasn't woke, and yet the market doesn't seem to be delivering it. And I said, that's got to be caused by the law. So you can see there's a general pattern caused by the intensity of preference. But when you see that it is monolithic, there you really do need to appeal to law, I said. Now, subsequently, it seems like you changed your mind. So my narcissistic question is, did I change your mind, or did you always know this and you were just going to go and explain it later on?
No. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Brian, but those essays were pretty, there wasn't a lot of time to change my mind. I think they were a few months apart or something. And the wokeness as law is something that I mentioned in the book that I've been thinking about for 10, 15 years.
All right.
And so
great minds do think alike then, but it's not that I deserve some credit.
Was that article after? Was that your article?
Yes. So basically my pieces were written in between. So you did get me thinking about this. And I said, well, look, you can explain a high level of something by preference, but you can't explain something being monolithic by preference, because there's just different preferences. There's going to be diversity unless you are crushing with the law any expression of true diversity. All right. Now, here's a quote from your book that I like quite a lot. You said, quote, "Wokeness resembles civil rights law more than it does the writings of any postmodern philosopher." end quote. Could you elaborate on that?
I mean, I'm just sort of frustrated and annoyed by these theories where these people have these ideas of these philosophers like Marcuse, Foucault, and and it's like they said these things, and sometimes you have people who go back. I had one review in Aporia, which is a good newsletter, where the guy talks about maybe we go back further and we talk about Jesus Christ, right? Because this is just Christianity in some form. And as a social scientist, and you're a social scientist too, obviously, what's the mechanism of causation? They never show it, right? A lot of these times I come away doubting that, if these people never existed, would the world be all that different? I don't know. In a lot of cases, obviously with Karl Marx or somebody, had a direct real world influence, but with others, I don't know. And so it's hard to even argue against the theories here that sort of philosophy is causing things to work, because there is no theory of sort of causation to act. It's a just so story. I wrote a piece called Against Idealism yesterday that makes this point. And so you look at sort of you can look at civil combination of like law, like obscure legal doctrine. And then some like basic human emotions, people can call this ideas, but like, women's tears, another essay, like just feeling, men wanting to be, feeling good towards women, having sort of wanting to help them, not wanting to argue with them, whites feeling guilt about the plight of Black Americans. You take that and you take civil rights law. It goes a long way to explaining much of what we see. I don't know. Do we need Foucault? Do we need Martin Luther? Do we need any of this other stuff?
I mean, I basically do agree with you, although think about some of the evidence that you presented. Like you said, look, obviously the whole existence of the API identity, Asian American Pacific Islander, is just caused by government. No one even used this phrase until government put it into official reports. But then you go and do the same kind of thing for intersectionality, which is actually a product of academia, and yet you will actually see businesses using this bizarre term now. So I think it's the same kind, those two kinds of evidence I would say are parallel. We'd say, look, this word emerged from this guy right here, and now people are using it a lot. Yeah. Something. It's not quite just a just so story, but it's not, doesn't mean that you're wrong in the big picture.
Yeah. It's a word. I mean, how much does the word intersectionality affect the way corporations behave? It seems like it's another word they use, but they report, their race and gender breakdowns and all the other things, in accordance with civil rights law. So, I think that, it did create civil rights law created a permanent pipeline between whatever is going on in the academy on these race and sex issues in corporate America. They're usually not directly applied, in that way, in the same way that the law functions. But these things aren't completely unimportant. They're there. I think the more steps in the, causal link you go back, the more you have to prove. You just prove this idea intersectionality, they use intersection. If you want to take that and go back to Foucault and then go to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, right? Yeah. And sounds like I'm burning a straw man, but this is sort of what people do when they're trying to explain this stuff. That's much harder to argue for.
Yeah. So speaking of Martin Luther, I liked your definition of wokeness, but here's a slightly different way that I think about it, and I'm curious about how you react. So to me, I think of there just being a general religion that revolves around the standard story group differences, which is that if one group is less successful than another, it's because they've been treated unfairly. This idea was fully taught to me in school in the 1980s. And if you read earlier things, it just seems to be taken for granted from the 60s on that group differences basically have to stem from unfairness. And then to me, wokeness is the fundamentalist interpretation of this doctrine. So in the same way that most Christians love the Bible and they say, yeah, this is a great book, it has all kinds of great stuff. And a fundamentalist is the one who says, yeah, but it says the world was made in 7 days, so it was made in 7 days. And anyone who says otherwise is terrible. I think of wokeness as basically being like those people. It's not they really even have new ideas. They just take ideas that are very widely held, but then they insist we must actually literally believe them and talk about them all the time. And anyone who says otherwise is evil. What do you think about that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do classify the Great Awakening a little bit of this. It's sort of
Mhm.
yeah, the
It's a
fundamentals.
revival. It's not a new religion. It's a revival.
It is remarkably, I mean, you, especially on race, I mean, it's remarkably similar. The stories in the 1960s that people were saying, the controversies, it was about quotas, it was about so-called police brutality, it was about inequality, and I mean, like, go back late 1960s, go back to the early 1990s. I mean, it's the exact story. You're right. I mean, that is yeah, I mean, that's true for everything. Like, a movement, any movement that's distinct just takes some broad principles that people agree with and then takes it to extreme. So, like, we have a society which usually lets markets operate. Some of us say markets should operate in places where most people don't want to take it that far, right? We're the sort of the fundamentalists of the pro market position. So that's often what political movements actually are.
I mean, the way that I think about it is that you've got we'll think about it like this. Most radicals have in their own minds this idea of I'm totally challenging my society. It's a revolution. I'm saying things no one has ever thought before. And you pay attention, like, no, it's the opposite. You're saying what almost everybody thinks, except you take it seriously.
Yeah.
That's the difference. So that's why I would say that libertarianism is quite different, because it's not just starting with something that's widely accepted. It's actually challenging widely accepted ideas,
Yeah.
which is, in a sense, really it's much more radical, because it's saying, look, our society is just wrong. And now we're going to, step one, we're wrong. And step two, we're going to take that wrongness seriously. Whereas wokeness, I think of as, look, of course, group differences are caused by unfairness. Everybody agrees with that, right? You wouldn't want to say otherwise. But now we're going to take it really seriously and be upset about it.
Yeah, there is an interesting distinction here in that, like, markets are sort of, markets are they are the default way we do things, but they're not something usually you praise. Although, you've seen most Americans say cap, and so we're the ones who saying live your lived preferences, or be consistent, but go against sort of the social desirability, right?
I mean, I think about, like, a real radical in a Christian society would be Satanist, something like that. Right, but you're not likely to have a satanic revolution. That's just weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Maoism, right? Where, like, the kids were just like the biggest supporters of Mao, right? And they were destroying their society over that. That's often what youth rebellion is.
Yeah. All right. Now you've got this complex multi-causal story, different factors interacting with each other, things change over time. So here's a question. Which institutions, or maybe factions within institutions, now actually want to enforce wokeness? Not they're doing it because the law says, but they've actually internalized it, and they in fact want to go beyond the law, or in fact would keep doing it or trying to do it even if the law said it was totally illegal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the universities are, where you have to start. I mean, people always worry about whether the law on affirmative action matters, or whether they're going to try to get around it. The thing about universities is, if that's your standard, that's the hardest case, because that's where you have the most ideologically committed people in society. So that might be the last thing that changes, but people sort of see it as a bellwether. And so I just when I spend time at universities more than private businesses or whatever. And yeah, I mean, when I walk around, like admissions offices and stuff like that, like, the stickers they have, the sort of the kind of people they have there, the things they talk about, just, you get the feeling that these people are true believers. They derive sort of their identity from, maybe they're not professors, but they're part of a university community. And that means being very liberal and left-wing on these identity issues. And so I think that, probably, you can look at institutions, different kind of institutions, people within institutions. It's I don't know. I mean, I think that, the conventional story from my book is, HR and DEI.
Yeah, so like HR, those people are true believers, and do they believe enough that they would actually stick their necks out and risk their jobs to do illegal stuff?
I don't have that impression, just because that's not my impression of most people. So it has to be some sort of unusual, particularly ideological group to want to do that. I think most HR people are probably, I would guess, is probably just sort of, they're afraid of the boss, and they'll push their ideas if they have an opportunity to. I don't, the young employees is another one that people think about a lot, and that seems to have sort of That seems to have peaked. I mean, you don't hear much about it, and it seems like management has sort of put the kibosh on that, and it seems like it's one of those things where they'll take the opportunity to care if they think they can get away with it. If they can't, it seems much less likely.
I mean, friends that I have who are at big corporations right now, they've said that after the Supreme Court affirmative action case, there have been meetings where their HR people go and they say, look, we realize that now we are under more legal scrutiny, but we've reviewed all of our policies and we think that they're fully legal. Yeah. They don't say we know they're fully legal. The tone is essentially, we could probably get away with this. Maybe we're not going to, but we're willing to go and risk some further legal action in the hopes that we can get as far, basically change as little as possible in response to the legal changes, which does sound to me like a fairly high degree of dedication. And I was saying, like, does anyone raise their hand and say, why take a chance? Why not just abandon all this nonsense so we can be totally legally safe and we just don't have to worry? And that is something where people are actually afraid even to say it because they know that they will be making a lot of enemies.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't expect the institutions or people to say we've been doing illegal stuff this whole time, especially since the Supreme Court.
Right. Well, like in the way they say is it's illegal now. Of course, we were fine before, but now maybe it's illegal, but we think we're okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that people are going to have that sort of much of a radical break with their own recent history. Right. And so, yeah.
But at the same time, they are endangering their firm, and you might think the CEO would say, no, I'm going to put the kibosh on this. We're not taking chances.
Yeah. I mean, I've had, I don't know, anecdotally, I've heard some other thing. I mean, I had somebody say in my, commented on my post the other day that, that they basically, they stopped, like the HR, like just now is become a lot more pro forma. They're just sending out like, reminder of the latest ethnic day, but they're not, like the programs and all this other stuff. You have to remember the Supreme Court case in SFFA v. Harvard is not directly about employment. At most, it's a hint about how the Supreme Court might rule on an employment case.
Yes, and yet, as you know, there was that letter from a bunch of red state attorney generals warning, I think, top Fortune 100 companies about what they say the law is anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So there's pressure coming from the other side, other side too. So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of stories recently. Just look at the broad picture of corporations. There was a sort of a bust in the market for DEI employees. That was in the Wall Street Journal piece. There's been a couple successful conservative boycotts, famously of Target and Bud Light, which is the stupidest boycott ever, but it apparently worked. And these things tend not to work before. I think it's combination. I think Musk buying Twitter is probably the main thing here. Probably that's a faster, more immediate change than the law. But I think the law at the same time is having an effect. I'm sort of I think that things are moving in the right direction on woke institutions.
I mean, when I read those pieces claiming that there's a big decline in DEI hiring, my memories was all anecdotal, and they basically just talking some DEI people and saying things are bad.
I saw at least one story. I think I saw at least one story where they had some data. They were looking at job listings.
And what fraction of actual fall in DEI employment had happened?
I forget.
5%.
I don't know. I don't know. I want me to look it up? I could probably get it in 2 seconds. DEI, Wall Street Journal, hiring decline. Let's see if that gives us anything in 2 seconds. The rise and fall of the chief diversity officer. Already shit. Everything is a battle. And so they have this article, falling demand. New analysis from employment data provider Live Data Technologies shows that chief diversity officers have been more vulnerable to layoffs than their human resource counterparts. 40% higher turnover. The number of CDO, chief diversity officer searches, is down 75% in the last year.
Although that could easily just be that they filled the slot. So create a slot, fill it, and then it goes down.
Yeah.
All right. So we got lots of questions.
This article's from July, so a couple months old.
All right. So here's a question, and it's so are there any notable cases where firms are actually so woke that when they get sued in a civil rights case, they don't aggressively try to not pay money? Have you ever heard of any such case? Cool. I haven't.
You mean they will just say, this is the
like roll over and say, we're sinners, here's $1 million.
Well, you can't do that because a lot of civil rights cases have injunctions. And so usually they'll stop you, or they'll give punitive damages and you can be sued again. So there's not some if you're discriminating against a group, there's not some there's not some tax you could pay and be
Well, I
done.
mean, but, the large majority of these cases are just an individual goes and sues you, right? And you could settle it. In fact, almost all of them do get settled.
Yeah, you're right.
So, I mean, the question is, you can imagine if you were a real true believer, someone would go and sue you and you would just say, you're so right, pay the money. I've never heard of any corporation being like that.
Well, you wouldn't do it publicly because people can keep coming after you if you do the same practice. But maybe they do that. I mean, that's why there are settlements. Well, I mean, against you're talking about if whites are suing for reverse discrimination.
No. I mean, I'm actually thinking of the normal kind. So someone who's black sues for discrimination, and the firm is so woke that they actually say, "Oh my God, like you're so right." How much do you want?
Of course they don't do. Yeah, they don't do that. You're right. There was a funny thing where the Trump, it was either the Department of Education or Department of Justice. Princeton put out a thing that like we are a horribly racist institution, and then the civil rights they started investigating.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
This is the basis of investigation, right?
Yeah, which then was totally dropped under Biden, right?
I would assume so.
Yes. All right, so now let's get into something more serious. Disparate impact law. You talk a lot about it. I studied this in quite a bit of depth when I was writing the case against education. So let me give you a little background. It's well known that employers care a lot about degrees and don't do much IQ testing. And there's a standard story that blames the Griggs case for this and says, well, of course, this is what's going on because now it is illegal to go and do IQ testing. So instead you go and you hire based upon academic credentials. And people even use the phrase, this is like IQ laundering. They are laundering the IQ scores. Schools can go and do standardized tests. Schools can effectively give an IQ test. Employers can't do it legally anymore. And this is a common story about why education is actually doing so well, is that it essentially serves the function that testing actually would have served. Now, I was very sympathetic to this story when I started writing the book. But then I started looking into questions and numbers, things like, well, how common are disparate impact cases in the first place? How hard are they actually to win? What are the payments typically? What's the settlement rate? And the conclusion that I walked away with is that this common story is just basically wrong. Maybe for very high profile companies that are worried about Jesse Jackson protesting them, they might actually have changed their behavior because of Griggs, and there might be something to this IQ laundering. But in general, my conclusion was that if there really were a lot of people that were highly qualified that you could pay a lot less money to without credentials, then firms would totally do it and just take the risk and defend themselves if it ever came up. I also did find some pieces saying that it's actually not that hard to defend yourself against these kinds of cognitive testing, disparate impact cases. And in fact, that of course, there's an arms race here where plaintiffs and defendants are both improving over time. But what seemed to me to be credible sources said defendants have gotten better faster than plaintiffs have. So what's your story here? And and just follow up point. Just to give you a follow up point. One of the facts that I discovered when researching this is that IQ employment testing is rare internationally, including in a lot of countries where they really just don't have laws like this, like Japan.
Yeah. Well, one thing about foreign businesses is that they usually suck. I mean, usually American businesses are a lot more efficient. So the fact that foreigners
that is qualitatively true, although at least the usual story out of people that measurement management is U.S. is the best in the world, but there's a bunch of other countries that are not that much worse. Like Japan is not supposed to be that much worse than the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, Japan.
So, what's your story? Like, am I just wrong about disparate impact doesn't matter that much? Because if it's not enough to go and stop people from doing IQ testing to find good workers without credentials, then how important can it be really?
So there is some data that I cite, some reports from the early days after Griggs, the early days as in like the first few decades, where they polled some employers, and they did find a decline in tests. So, it's interesting to look at the sort of immediate aftermath of the civil rights.
But a decline from a low level to a lower level, not a decline from it was the standard method to.
No, it was pretty high. Who had some kind of cognitive test. I think it actually started out pretty high. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's somewhere in the book. Also, what you see in the I rely on Frank Dobbin's sociologist work on this. You see a greater formalization of all parts of all parts of hiring. So everything from the likelihood of putting up a job description to structured interviews to like structured performance reviews. You see that like a lot they're taking discretion out of it. And what seems to be the story is this is all being shaped by civil rights. You can't have discretion. You can't have too much objectivity either. You can't have an IQ test. But it does seem like the civil rights laws really are shaping how people. Now, whether it's hard or it's easy to win a suit. I mean, I think it's hard or easy depends on it's sort of like the number of civil rights lawyers and the number of good civil rights lawyers is a sort of a scarce quantity out there. And so it's, I think that like how hard it is, or it's how easy it is, you're easier to defend yourself with deeper pockets and also more of a target if you have deeper pockets. So a lot of this, it's hard to know sort of what's inherently hard or what's not hard because they're taking so many precautions, throughout the hiring and the employment process. Right. And so, I think that there is a sort of, it's hard. I mean, it's just hard to say. I mean, you're asking like, if you're trying to sort of predict the way the market goes in the absence of some regulation, as free market guys, we know that's a fool's
errand. I mean, one thing is you look at
Yeah.
countries where they don't have the same regulations or the same legal liability.
Yeah.
I mean, like a story that I actually have a lot of sympathy for is that lawyers at major businesses are ultra risk averse. And they actually serve as a kind of interest group where they're just doing things legally safe rather than maximizing profit. And some CEOs will push back on them and others won't. And I think here about the case of Uber, which in my mind really stands out. Here, this is clearly a case where I think obviously what they're doing was totally illegal. And yet they hired some lawyers and they said, your job is to tell me how to do whatever I want to do lawfully and do not tell me it's illegal. And, and as a result, they became a huge business. If it is a small amount of money, then you can see maybe CEOs will just let the lawyers have their way. But if it's a lot of money, on the other hand, then it seems like you would crack down on them and say, look, your job is not to set policy. Your job is to defend us.
Well, if you're going to blame the lawyers, why not just blame HR? Right? It's the same theory. They're just risk averse people, and plus they're woke on top of that too. And so that would be much simpler sort of. More direct theory. My reading
that is a more different team though, right? So usually there's a separate legal division at a corporation, which is not the same as HR. They're the ones that are saying, let's avoid doing things that will get us sued.
No, but the HR people are all, I mean, I think they're also, that's part of their purview too. They're trying to comply with the law too, right? And they're also just shaping sort of the discourse around what's good. What are good, what's predictive and what works as a hiring criterion and what doesn't.
Here, let's just do a quick break, Richard. So you're the one who's got the JD from the University of Chicago, Richard. So here's my understanding. Almost all discrimination cases are brought by aggrieved employees and former employees. So my story is that hostile work environment is way more important than disparate impact, except maybe for some very prominent firms. Am I wrong?
I mean, I think that if you include sexual harassment under hostile work environment, I think that's right. So
my memory is only 4% of discrimination cases are disparate impact.
Yeah, I mean, and to even have the information to have a disparate impact case, you sort of need to get the ball rolling in the first place, right? You don't have. It's not like it's not like employers make that information publicly available so people can sue them. So I think that's right.
I think you do talk more about disparate impact than about hostile workplace law.
Yeah. Well, there is other aspects of disparate. Disparate impact is a broad thing that covers not only employment, but covers law enforcement. It covers government hiring, and actually, overseas. I was looking at France the other day. They actually do make more use of standardized tests while we don't. So that's like one place where you can look and you can see the direct historical record of civil rights law sort of destroying merit in government hiring. Maybe tests are not the best way, but they seem better than whatever the alternative. It's just who or lottery or whatever. I think if you're just looking at the workplace, I do devote a lot of time to hostile work environment and sexual harassment and all these things. But disparate impact is a broader theory because it encompasses sort of everything in society.
So, continuing with a hostile work environment, you go over this conflict between civil rights and civil liberties. You've got these two lines. You've got the rights that aid all others, and you've also got this lies about lies line. I mean, I would say that, again, these very specifically are about hostile work environment. It is the hostile work environment that means that you can't say what you want, can't tell jokes, cannot talk about politics. And furthermore, the lies about lies, it's really just very narrowly on this hostile work environment, because without that doctrine, you wouldn't have to lie. You could go and give a speech saying, all right, yeah, so look, we all know what the statistics are here, but like, because of the quotas, we got to go and do this. So at least then you could go and talk about it without someone saying the mere discussion of the fact is itself a form of discrimination.
So yeah, and for that lies about lies line, I think I was talking about specifically the EEOC posters, which is sort of a direct mandate from government. I think they tell you exactly what a poster says. And so that poster, tells you we're an equal employment, institution, and we, practice affirmative action. It's in the same thing. And we haven't talked about affirmative action in government hiring or in government contracting, which is just sort of a sort of direct brute force. This is what you've got to do, and you've got to keep that data, and you've got to, show us some of the data that you've got. And so,
but it's the hostile work environment law that makes a person reasonably nervous about going in and pointing to that sign and saying, this sign is full of lies. Obviously, there's a contradiction here.
Yeah, probably. Well, that's another lie on top of lie on top of lie, right? Yeah. The poster's a lie and not a lie, and the other, you have to lie about the poster. Yeah.
Right. But if you could just go and eviscerate that one particular doctrine, it would do so much to restore civil liberties to the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, then it was, and if you hadn't had the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which created punitive damages for this stuff, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. So, there was a big takeoff in the 1990s and sexual harassment lawsuits. You could see it in the book. Our complaints.
I mean, most people at the time would have just said Anita Hill, but yeah, I think that's got to be.
Yeah, it was all sort of the same thing. Case. I mean, there was, it was, it was there in the culture, and there was demand for a new Civil Rights Act, which was a big issue in Washington. Bush, vetoed the first one. And so, yeah, it's, and
if you're alive at the time, part of the hilarity was that people on the news didn't know how to pronounce the word harassment. So there was there was like harassment and harassment. And so you could see they had not even heard the word that much because they didn't know what the standard pronunciation was yet. But now there wouldn't be any issue any longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm too young for that, but that's a very interesting sort of. Do you remember the debate? Was the debate over the Civil Rights Act 1999? Was that even a thing? Was that
there was barely any talk about it? Actually, it's really just flew mostly below radar. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's something else that I wanted to say about this. Let's see. Oh yes. Like one of my proposals, which I don't think you talked about in the book, it would just be for courts to very vigorously say First Amendment rights take precedence over discrimination law. And so essentially anytime someone is suing for discrimination using arguments that are a even plausible or possible threat to the First Amendment, they're just stopped from going and even bringing them up. You can't even introduce it as evidence. You could either do this legislatively or judicially, I think. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the general trend is the First Amendment has been winning in the as a broad matter in the judiciary. So Citizens United, right? Corporations have free speech rights. You can donate as much money as you want to a super PAC. So like money is speech is sort of a new idea, or it's been taken a lot further than it has in the past. So stuff like pornography, that's become more, the restrictions on that have become harder and harder for government to enact. And so even like religious freedom and religious liberty have been going in this. Some of these are left-wing things, some of these are right-wing things, but the general trend is towards the First Amendment expanding. The only place where it hasn't even begun to encroach is civil rights law, is harassment law. And so there's a natural.
You might think that telling a joke would be protected speech, and to say, well, it's not the government that's punishing you, it's just we create a right to sue your employer, and then whatever happens.
the precedent for this is sort of the labor laws. So like if people will complain, like you're an employer and you go, I really hate unions. You really shouldn't be in a union. It sucks. This is how much life will suck. Like the National Labor Relations Board will come after you for that. And you could argue that also is a kind of free speech, right? And so we're already past the point where like you have free speech at work, like it's regulated in 100 different ways. But yeah, if people can bring the First Amendment into this, and give it more, make it sort of a live doctrine within the workplace. Yeah, I'm all for that. That I think is probably the cleanest and most straightforward way to doing this, is having conservative legal scholars sort of. But who wants to be, who wants to make? Do corporations want to make a First Amendment argument? Maybe in some cases, maybe in some cases, but that might be a complication.
Now, one thing that I haven't seen much in the reviews is that The Origins of Woke is a funny book. There's just a lot of just pretty hilarious moments. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you talk about what I consider to be the funniest part of all of civil rights law, which is the equal opportunity sexual harassment defense.
Yeah.
I want me to tell you about it? So, I'm not sure how much you know about it, but am I right that you didn't talk about it?
No, I mentioned it. It might have been even a footnote, but I do mention it somewhere.
Okay. So it's also just called the bisexual defense.
Oh, yeah. No, I talk about it in the text too, where I talk about how ridiculous it would be if you hit on fat men and skinny women or something. Do you remember this?
I don't think so.
I might have. You know what? The editor might have suggested. I think it might not be in there. I'm not sure, but I thought about it at least, and I think it's so. I think it's somewhere in there. Yeah.
I mean, so what's shocking to me about this is, so I had originally heard a oversimplified story, which is that there was a bisexual employer in the 70s who said, I don't discriminate, I harass everybody. And then the court said, yeah, we're not going to let you do that. But the actual story is that some jurisdictions said that, and other ones have actually created this as a recognized offense. And you really can actually be accused of sexual harassment of a woman, and you bring up some guy on the stand and say, he harassed me too, and then you win. It's like, what other area of law works this way? Where it's like, you're accused of murder. It's like, yeah, but I also beat up a guy. Like, well, then we have to let you off. It's just insane. But this is
the entire doctrine of sexual harassment was always a weird thing from the start, because it's not discriminating. But if you like somebody who is of a certain sex, it's not necessarily because of their sex. So there was a very long time, decades, where really sexual harassment wasn't a thing. It really wasn't until the 1980s that it was even covered at all. Under probably in the 70s too in some cases, but the Supreme Court wasn't until the 1980s it ratified it. So this wasn't sort of a natural implication of the Civil Rights Act, and then it became so the courts took this seriously, the question of how is this really discrimination against women. And so some of them said, okay, it's like women are the only people you would harass because you're heterosexual. But in the case where you're bisexual, I mean, this doesn't come up. That's why there's a circuit split, right? That's why there's in that article you sent me. That's why there's different courts have ruled different ways. But yeah, I mean, the logical argument is if you are somebody whose appetites are capacious, you hit on men and women, potentially, you're not violating the Civil Rights Act because you're hitting on everyone equally, right? That it has to be fitted to sort of what the Civil Rights Act to some extent actually says.
I mean, so my understanding of the way the law works is that officially, if it's welcome attention, then it's not discrimination. But if it's unwelcome, then it is. So the idea is that it's only a problem if the person doesn't want it. But then, as the singer Morrissey explained, well, how do you know whether somebody wants your attention until you show them some attention, in which case you may already be too late. Yeah, so you do a very good job in the book of saying that firms are not going to have a policy of only do moderate attention, and then if there's pushback, stop. It's just opening up the floodgates to a bunch of litigation. So just say we have zero tolerance for anything, and that's okay.
Yeah, this is Eugene Volok's argument. It's a severe and pervasive, right? And so that's the standard. What does that mean? Well, pervasive is sort of hard because it depends on the aggregate actions of more than one person, and so that naturally leads to a zero tolerance policy. Yeah, that makes sense. That sort of is a straightforward explanation of how you get from something that sort of sounds reasonable in the abstract to a place where something that doesn't sound reasonable to most people, which is just zero tolerance.
I mean, all backed up by this corruption of it's not the government that is telling you to do this. The government just creates a right of legal action and then your employer does it. So it's really nothing to do with the government.
Yeah.
I had this piece where I said lawsuits are the hitman of the state, where it really is like the Texas law where you can go and sue abortionists and then say it's not government. It's just a person, but it's like the government created a lawsuit. So of course it's the government. It's just getting your hands off, your fingerprints off of the murder weapon.
Yeah. There's a book I cite in my book that I forget the title and author right now, but yeah, it argues that this is a general trend. The Congress has been doing a lot more of this. It's been doing a lot more of outsourcing rights to private. NEPA sort of works like this too. Environmental law works like this. And this is good for government doesn't have to pay doesn't have to spend as much money. There's a general there's other people who've written about sort of the privatization of government where they're employing not as many people directly but using a lot of consultants and using a lot of contractors. And yeah, that's part of this. I mean, in civil rights law, it was very the history I go into a little bit but not that much, in that at first the civil rights lobby did not want this system. They wanted a strong EEOC, which would just come in and tell people what to do. But then after a little while, they ended up that the conservatives started to want a stronger EEOC and less these lawsuits, because people saw that the lawsuits were actually a very effective way to enforce civil rights law. So the EEOC, the NAACP and these organizations, they came around to actually being in favor of this current model that we have now.
But I mean, a lot of your story is that it's only in the last 10 or 15 years the Republicans actually became solidly against civil rights law.
Well, they were always fighting on the margins, right? They would always be like, make it a little easier, make it a little harder. They were the first Civil Rights Act of 1990. Back that long ago, I think they mostly or substantially voted against it, and then when the Bush came back, agreed with the other one, then they almost unanimously voted for it. So they always have been relatively, since the 70s, have been relatively more, but like the idea that like right now, any action you would take, and if anything came up in Congress to add to the damages of anything that would make a burden of proof or make it easier to file a civil rights lawsuit or more profitable, I'm pretty sure that like every Republican would be against it now. It's not like it was 20, 30 years ago.
What if it was political discrimination? Do you think you could get Republican support for that?
Yeah, I mean that's what Vivek wants to do. I mean, it's just not in their. It's just sort of unnatural for Republicans and conservatives to do this. So there's like this antitrust stuff where like these conservatives like hate big tech, so they'll like and start adopting all these leftist anti-tech antitrust talking points, and usually they're not as, it doesn't seem like there's as many of them that are as into it as leftists are. Maybe you can get them excited about that, but I don't think so. I think they're more likely to be more trying to negate what liberals do than doing anything positive on their own end.
So you already mentioned the 1991 Civil Rights Act. Here's the big question in my mind. How much of civil rights law remains judge-made? Because my understanding is a lot of what that law did is it codified what judges had been doing for the previous 25 years or so.
It's worse than that. It actually, the court in the 1980s was making it harder to win disparate impact suits. Civil Rights Act specifically said, go back to the 91 Act. 91 Act. Go before Ward's Cove. So it was overruling. There was 7 or 8 times this happened where the Supreme Court was actually going in the right direction, and then there was a legislative response. And so you see how bad Congress was on these issues, that like conservative intellectuals as represented on the court were going in one direction. We're already saying this is too far. But members of Congress were basically just going along with whatever the left wanted to do on these issues. And so I mean and so a lot of the stuff did end up being codified. Now the disparate impact standard, judges can basically do what they want. I mean that's that's just sort of the reality. The disparate impact standard is not explicitly. It's very weird. The 1991 Civil Rights Act. It says use the disparate impact standard that was before Ward's Cove. It doesn't say codify disparate impact. If you didn't want to use it, you could be clever and say, this doesn't actually mandate disparate impact. There's also a constitutional argument potentially against disparate impact. There's also things you could do in margins to make the disparate impact harder. This gridlock can work in our favor. Gail Heriot points out that the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which created punitive damages for a lot of these lawsuits, it's not indexed to inflation. So it just becomes less and less money as time goes on, and then it becomes like the punitive damages don't really matter at some point. So in some ways, stagnation can actually be a benefit. But yeah, there's always something you can do among judges, and especially on race and race issues. There's always the Constitution there, ready to be sort of invoked for whatever argument a judge wants to make.
My friend David Bernstein has the book Classified about how government creates new races, but you also have some pretty good discussion of this. So how does government create a new race out of nothing?
It just, tells you to check a box, and then people are so, conformist. They start to believe it. And so, yeah, the Hispanic category, this word wasn't even commonly used. Latino, they go up in the late 1960s, 1970s. Asian American, Pacific Islander, I think it's sort of a the sort of a reductio ad absurdum of this. Like, could you just make something up that has no basis in reality?
It's like an Eskimo / Malaysian or something.
Eskimo / Malaysian. Although the Alaskan Natives, I do think, do have their own category, but you're pretty much right. Siberian.
We just make up a totally new thing. It's like a French or a Ural indigenous.
And I'm shocked. It seems like the AAPI really took off when the coronavirus thing happened, and they wanted the narrative of like the Chinese are being attacked, but they made it AAPI are being attacked. And you see stop AAPI. And there's a funny wokeness is law sort of codex to this, where it's like the university, the Stop AAPI hate organization is based in the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University. So it's the state of California that AAPI sort of had, they broke up AA and PI at the federal level, but the state of California sort of picked up the cause and just funded this.
What God hath joined, let not man put asunder.
Yeah. So it was amazing. And this was everywhere. AAPI, you only started seeing it around 2020. And it's just, I just wonder how people don't feel silly, like talking like this. Like, how do they not be embarrassed? It's just a funny thing.
I mean, the Hispanic one has really weighed on me a lot because I grew up in Los Angeles. There's a lot of Hispanic students there. And then when my sons were becoming fluent in Spanish, we started spending more time with Spanish speakers, going to more Spanish speaking countries. And that's when I realized that literally my physical perception of your skin color is actually influenced by whether you're speaking with a Spanish accent. And I just started talking. I was like, wait a second. This guy, if I just had him on mute, he would totally be white. Yeah. But because he speaks Spanish, my mind is actually darkening his skin color as I talk to him. And it's like, this is crazy.
You notice that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Like definitely in Sicily, the whole country is full of people who would classify as Hispanic based upon their skin color. And yet they're speaking Italian. So, of course, we would never think of them as Hispanic at all. But they're at least as dark as, say 30 or 40% of Americans that we call Hispanic. So it's the one where it's almost liberating when you realize someone just made this stuff up and you are then allowing it to confuse your thinking. And it's actually at the level of it is making you see things because you believe they're there when they are not.
Yeah. And it was you. And so in the initial, initially in government, they would say Spanish speaking. The emphasis was on people needed help, specifically because maybe they weren't speaking English, so they needed, government assistance with assimilation. Hispanic sort of became a shorthand, and then it became racialized to mean anyone permanently, no matter what language they spoke, from descent from certain Spanish-speaking countries,
including Spain.
Yeah, well, the Spain thing is interesting. There's sort of a gray area depending on what you're looking at. But it's you can really convince people. You can really, this is just stuff that is no liberal defends the racial classification system, really. I just think they see it as okay, if you start, it's like a Jenga tower, or if you take out this weak thing, so I think that they don't want to think about it, or they don't want to talk about it. But yeah, I think nobody would defend how ridiculous this whole thing is.
mean, one of the craziest woke stories I ever heard was a woke dad was really angry that his kids were being taught Spanish in school because he thought it was appropriation for his white children to learn Spanish. And it's like, Spanish is a European language, you dummy.
Was this a news story? Was this somebody you knew?
No, it was a news story. Yeah, like it's, it's just the kind of things people share on Twitter is like news of the weird. But I mean, I don't think there's a serious number. My guess is still that for an Anglo to speak good Spanish is still considered a positive.
There was a scene in the Barbie movie. Did you see Barbie movie?
No, but I know.
The woke half Hispanic daughter tells her dad, but he says, "Si se puede." Yes, we can. And she says, "That's appropriation." Right? People sort of debate. One great piece of art criticism is people debate the extent to which the Barbie movie is actually woke or self-aware, but that's a different discussion.
All right, so you got this fairly long discussion of Title IX in sports. So I'll just say that as a non-sports person, I never thought about this until I read your book. So just to start off, explain the insanity.
This Title IX sports stuff, it was a big story when I was a kid where you would watch, like, I wasn't even political, I would watch ESPN, and ESPN would have these documentaries on how, like, wrestling was getting canceled because they needed, colleges were required to have an equal number of male and female athletes. And so Title IX...
Not wrestlers, athletes, right?
Yeah, athletes, but wrestlers, there's too many wrestlers. But wrestling, you're not going to cut the football team. So basketball, so wrestling had to go in a lot of places. And so like the Education Amendments of 1972, all they say is no discrimination in education that receive federal funding. That's all it says. That's literally all it says. The government in the 1990s says, okay, it's discrimination. You're discriminating against women if there are not an equal number of male and female athletes.
And how do you come up with something like that? You got a sentence, and then from that you say a number of athletes must be equal.
Yeah, there's a book, The Transformation of Title IX, that goes into painstaking detail of sort of like the steps and the sort of innovations the innovations here that were used by government bureaucrats. But and so it's so strange. First of all, colleges fight it. I mean, the argument they make is we're not discriminating against women. We don't like women's sports, but like males have more interest in sports, and there's more, potential profit for the university or whatever. They lose.
And do colleges actually publicly say this kind of thing?
They go to court. There are major court decisions on this, and they fight this. And
but that's different from actually giving a press conference where you go and defend yourself, right? And say this is actually fine.
Well, I mean, a federal lawsuit is a pretty pretty clear public statement of your position, right?
But it's also one where your money is on the line, so you can see why people would say things they're not very comfortable saying in order to avoid paying millions of dollars. But still, like the actual sense of we're being ridiculously oppressed here would come. That would be, I think, where you go and talk to the media. When there's no law.
Well, I mean, there was comments. I mean, there was comments in the media. There was one, I think it was Quinnipiac, who said it's pretty crazy. The president of Quinnipiac said, pretty crazy. We can cut libraries, but not, we can't cut female sports, because sometimes judges would say, no, you can't cut the male sports. You just have to get those, get those women numbers up. And it's, ridiculous. I mean,
so they actually say you must achieve it by raising the number of female athletes. You can't even do
in some
obvious thing of cut male sports too.
Yeah, in some cases.
Does this mean that schools must have sports? What if a school just doesn't have any sports?
Yeah, that's the point. Like, you can cut libraries, you can do whatever. But the civil rights bureaucrats have focused on female sports and making women, play masculine sports too. Because if you try to make cheerleading, they say it's not competitive.
It's a physical activity. It's not a sport.
Yeah, exactly. So this is still like, and there's stories about ridiculous. Like there's ways to count male athletes as female athletes if you put them in like a practice player on like the women's basketball team, and you get a guy to be a female athlete. I mean, they're really doing, and they have rowing. Like they have rowing, because rowing, you can just stuff as many women. Like apparently rowing is very labor intensive as a sport. And so I talked to some girl at UCLA who was like, oh yeah, I was a rower for like 2 weeks. I didn't like it. They begged me, go recruit your friends. Like they had just like a circle of friends who would just join the rowing team and just stop because nobody cared about rowing. It was, and this is the USC scandal. It was all about rowing because female rowing is a big thing because they need to get those female athlete numbers up. And so this is, and it's high school too. I mean, they do this too. It is a very sort of it's maybe not that important in the grand scheme of things. It's sort of like a case. It is, important to some people, but it's like a case study in sort of the ridiculousness of this whole process and the degree to which they engage in social engineering. And then
if you're going to call it discrimination because there are more male athletes than women, why isn't it discrimination to admit more men than women for a school?
Women actually, Arshep Melnick, political scientist, points out women do better than men in every facet of higher education. So student government, music, drama, whatever. The civil rights regime never cared about any of that.
Now, is your story precisely just that since women are doing better, then they don't care? Or is it that somehow they got fixated on sports? Or is it that if they were to go and crack down on, say, STEM schools there are still some STEM schools that have more men than women, but is there some idea of like to crack down on that would be so central to the school's mission in a way they can go and be unreasonable about sports precisely because it's not that big of a deal?
Well, there's more freedom of movement. So like you have to really, if you wanted like theoretical physics, you really would have to change the field. If you're just sort of adding, you can always clone, a female, you can always make a clone of whatever men are doing. You can make a female kind of sport, or you can have a different kind of sport.
Well, you could imagine the same kind of creativity in trying to satisfy the letter of the law while violating the spirit for academics too. You could go and say, well, theoretical physics are also going to have sparring partners for physics, and those could be women. You could really do that if you were under the gun, right?
Yeah. You could. Yeah, you could.
Do you think of it as randomness that sports got targeted, or is there something special about sports that made it vulnerable?
I don't know. My understanding, my sort of just superficial read of the history of like how they became obsessed with sports is that like there was a lot of celebrity female athletes or semi-celebrity who were really into women's sports and like really liked the idea and just became activists, and this sort of became a kind of cool thing to do. I'm not sure. The Title IX, the affirmative action of the lowering standards, that's an old debate, right? The extracurriculars are their extracurriculars are something else. It is there, but I do think there is a. It's weird. Like, when do they care about women? When do they care about women doing better? So there's an employment law. There is there was a civil rights lawsuit about flight attendants where they were discriminating in favor of women, and then a man sued and won. And so in that case,
also a Hooters case.
Yeah, and so it seems like there's a hostility towards like gender stereotyping. So just like a college with male football players and female cheerleaders, and that being the cool thing is just offends people within the university and within the civil rights bureaucracy to such a degree that they have to do something about it. And so like, although the standard rule, and so like even they overcome the standard rule in the employment context because having, women as flight attendants, it sort of feeds into the stereotypes. It's a weird. I'm sure there's probably somebody who's written about this, but the history behind this, there's a lot more probably that's there that I haven't looked into.
Now, in the background of your book is a strong and unpopular stance on the causes of group disparities, and it's one where I think you and I are on the same page, which comes down to there's a lot of reasons for disparities. There are differences in ability, differences in preferences. There's just cultural difference. There's just so many different reasons, and yet there is this dogma that unfairness is almost the only possible cause. Now, here's my question. Can it really be that lots of smart people are such fools about this? Like just say, like, obviously there's multiple causes here.
It's, it's disturbing the extent to which, I find this sort of, I don't know about you, Brian, but when I see like there's a Scientific American article, where they say, science has shown, men and women are the same, and male athletes are only better than female athletes because they have better nutrition or something stupid like that. I see war crimes or something, and I'm like, okay, that's bad. That bothers me. But then, like, this bothers me in a different way, in that, like, there's a distortion of sort of the human intellect is just in these ends is just so deeply offensive to me. And so, yes, obviously they are wrong, and like how people can believe such ridiculous things, I don't know. It sort of alienates me from much of humanity.
So, here's a story that I've gotten when I've talked to the smartest leftists off the record. It comes down to, of course, you're totally right, but your standards for fairness are so low. We should have the standard where it's not fair unless we have done everything in our power to correct the disparity, regardless of its causes. So in a way, I think of it as just tautological continental philosophy of oppression is whatever leads to disparities. And so they can grant your point on the facts and then say that doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. Yeah. And yet I notice they're only saying this to me privately. They're not going to get on in front of a lectern and say, all right, look, obviously, like the real story is this, but that doesn't matter because of morality.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things there. So yeah, you could believe that racism against, say, blacks is such a bad problem in society that, like, even if you have affirmative action, even if you have, untrue theories of group differences, it's like they are being held back so much that, like, you're not going to make up for it. All you're going to do is maybe, have all the corporate diversity programs in the world. You'll maybe make up 20% of it. And maybe that's, all we should, that we should be doing then. We shouldn't say or do anything that will, like, give credence to anyone who would push back against these left-wing policies, right?
Yeah, but even there's this factual claim that, like, we just know for a fact that racism is the overwhelming cause, and it's like, how do you know that?
Yeah, that's true, and what they will point to. I mean, this actually, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to than the complete blank slatist. Everything is caused by discrimination, because I think that if you don't look closely at data and you just sort of trust institutions, like, you will see these, like, leftists write these articles in some mainstream publication, like, this person is a denier of systemic racism, and we have all these papers that show everything from housing to the size of your bathroom to air. It's all racist, and they will have a million studies, and nobody's going to read a fraction of those studies. It's just, what's your prior, right? Do you believe market forces, or do you believe that every single thing is racist, and, like, and that academia is, like, in a good enough shape that they are in the position to rationally analyze this question and come to reasonable conclusions? Well, if I tell you there's a mountain of literature, are you inclined to believe it or not? Me and you will probably say on a hot button issue, I'm inclined to say it's probably all BS. If I hear some new study about racism without looking into it, my prior is it's probably nonsense. But if someone has a different prior,
right, but there's the prior, but there's also did you consider any alternative hypothesis? And if they say, well, no, well, then this is not real. This is, as a German colleague of mine said, this is not science. It's not science.
Yeah. I think, what I'm saying there is just, you could look at, like, the causes of group disparities as, like, a very narrow question. And maybe many smart leftists don't believe, every standardized test is racist. They might think that they measure something and they're real. They might also say, look, there is all this quote unquote literature here about air quality and maternal nutrition and a million other things that I don't have the time to check. But, we have to, even though the test is fair, we have to give blacks or whatever group a little bit of an advantage to make up for all the literature that's over here, right? All the literature that, I have not looked at, but I assume is true, because imagine if everything was lies on top of lies on top of lies. I don't assume that.
Where I thought you were going with this was somewhere very different. I thought you were going to say that the normal view, that most people just don't realize how big the disparities really are, or in particular, how big differences in ability and preference are. So when they see it, if they saw a small difference, they sure that could be ability, that could be preference. Yeah. They see a big difference, they know that must be unfairness. It's like, maybe there are big ability differences, maybe there are big preference differences.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah, I think that's part of this story of causation. I mean, there's been a little bit of debate I saw on Twitter. It's like, are we overestimating the black-white gap in crime? And somebody had an argument that seemed plausible on its face, that, like, in the FBI crime statistics, the big cities participate, a lot of rural white areas don't participate, and therefore. But I mean, come on, we've all been around big cities. We know sort of the demographic situation and where all the murder is.
Although I would say, I think even most intuitive race realists who don't look at numbers, if you say, like, what is the black murder rate compared to the white murder rate? And they're like, I don't know, like twice as high. And you're like, you don't even know what we're talking about. Twice as high. No. Way more.
Yeah. I mean, they are extreme. I mean, they make people uncomfortable. And, this is part of the story, like the story that I was telling, where it's like a matter of, like, there must be, if you were going to show them that, right, they would say, wow, all these factors that contributed to race, or maybe they would, or maybe if they knew they'd agree, maybe that's why leftists have to sort of suppress the race stats, because if people do say like, wow, not all of that can't be racism, maybe half of that is racism, there's still a huge gap. I think if you want to like steelman liberalism, like I think the better version, or at least the one I would be more inclined to buy, is something along the lines of like social. It's a social peace. Like we, race relations in America could be much worse. We do have race riots every few years, but it's generally peaceful. Blacks stick to themselves and whites stick to themselves, and our buildings aren't all getting burned down. Our institutions function, and the police, sometimes they riot over police, but it would be 1,000 times worse if like we had merited police hiring and they were all white guys, right? You can imagine that like the situation in our cities could be worse. So this sort of noble lie, I think some leftists believe in. I think that's probably the best argument for what they do.
All right. So here's another major intellectual issue lurking in the background, which is stereotype accuracy. You probably know quite a bit of Lee Jussam's work. It's a major area in psychology, despite all of the stigma against it. So here's my question for you. What do you think are the strongest exceptions to stereotype accuracy? We both know stereotypes are really accurate, but what are the stereotypes that you just think are wrong?
So I think you'll like this one. I think on immigration, I think people overestimate how dangerous illegal immigrants are. Muslim terrorism too. I think just because there's a general just sort of nationalism, anti-foreigner bias, and so when you have that, I think people. I think if you ask people to estimate what percentage of crime is committed by illegal immigrants, I would love to see what Republicans say, probably 60 or 70% or something like that. And so I think there's a general. Hispanic. Somebody sent me some data from Spain that I posted on Twitter, where like Colombians had like, and people from Peru had like crime rates like comparable to Chinese, below British people living in Spain.
I mean, to be lower than Spanish murder rates is already crazy low. So
it is. I mean, and British, you figure the British expats in Spain must be pretty law abiding. You would assume.
I mean, I hear so like in the 1980s there was this very widespread stereotype of Poles are stupid, which I think has almost died. I'm thinking about the Poles a lot because I've been to Poland 3 times in the last 2 years. And it's like, where did that one come from? That just seems totally made up. I'm quite baffled by it.
Yeah, they might have been just, new immigrants, and maybe they were a little bit lost in American culture. So, I think the anti-foreigner bias, I think, to explain sort of what about the idea that like Jews are sneaky? I mean, they're good at money, and I think people just think good at money means sneaky because they have an anti-market bias too. So maybe
there's also like Jews being really overrepresented in law. I think that's the only that alone I think probably makes the stereotype accurate. If you just have a lot of lawyers in your group, then your group on average will have high sneakiness.
I don't know. Most lawyers I've met have been pretty moral people. Like they've been people who take ethics seriously. Actually, I don't have
their ethics, which is fake ethics. It's legal ethics, which is almost the opposite of actual ethics.
Yeah, because like you defend your client. Yeah, but I mean I think that
zealously.
I think, but a lot of lawyers could be acting a lot worse than they actually they could get a lot more. Sort of like Better Call Saul. Like they could be like if you have like I think that like if you can actually get around away with a lot more than what most lawyers do.
I mean, I would say probably most of the real errors in stereotypes are for gender stereotypes. Like you've probably seen stuff on, we have a very strong stereotype that men hit women, women don't hit men. And yet almost everyone who has actually looked at the numbers says that is not true.
But I believe women, like I've seen, like, I believe like women hit men. I was watching, you watch a show where it's like a woman will just like punch a guy on the shoulder or like hit him or something. Do a lot of women like seriously beat men and like
so that's a great question. So again, I was surprised by this too when I started reading it, but the main story is that obviously women are physically weaker and not because of bad nutrition, but women are much more likely to use weapons. Women are much more likely to do things like light a guy on fire while he's asleep, and women are also likely to use male accomplices, which then in the data actually get written down as multiple offender attacks. And so but anyway, this is right. So like, even when I've talked to feminists who work on this issue and they say, we know that one's wrong. And it's like, wow. Right? So that's one that's quite striking to me. Yeah. I mean actually like another one that is just like the idea of women are nice. right? Which I'd say like it's a stereotype that's quite strong in general. And yet I'd say it actually depends very much on context and who you are. Women are nice to kids, although men are also nice to kids. I mean, or like another one of just women commit a lot more child abuse, which when you think about it, it's like, yeah, of course that's true because they're around kids a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of sort of men. Yeah. I mean, there's the idea that sort of men are, I think people maybe perceive men as more sort of confident and together than they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like men are terrified of rejection. I mean, this is one where on the one hand, we've got these stereotypes of the guy who is so terrified of rejection that he won't even talk to a woman. And you get a lot of humor out of that in comedies. And yet at the same time, harassment law is really based upon the idea of the typical guy as a sexual predator who will just take any opportunity that he sees.
Yeah. If not the typical guy, there's enough of a sort of aggressive sort of critical mass. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I've also got this view that I think a lot of women have a false stereotype of men based upon their own selected experience, because the men that women actually talk to are the confident guys.
Yeah.
The aggressive guys, and they actually start thinking of these are typical males. It's like, look, the typical males are the ones that don't talk to you. Those are the typical ones.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's funny. Sometimes you'll be talking to a woman who's very attractive, and she'll be like, guys never hit on me, and I'm sure it's probably and her her inference from that is I must be ugly or unattractive rather than most of them are just scared to death of you. Yes. I think that's right. Like I think these stereotypes are going to. I think even like I think this is changing a little bit. Mm-hmm. I remember sort of like if you watch like Married with Children or something, it was sort of the stereotype of the culture was just like men, sort of didn't care. They maybe they liked women and they would go after women, but they weren't like afraid of women and like sort of the men Married with Children world. I don't know if our like media has changed. Or reality. I think they both probably change in the direction of we stereotype less men as less confident, and also they're actually less confident than they used to be.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this reminds me of one of my favorite original thought experiments. So here's my thought experiment. Genie comes to you and he says, I can go and set your attractiveness anywhere you want on the 0 to 10 scale, but remember, you will get all the good parts of being more attractive and all the bad parts of being more attractive. So I've asked this on Twitter. I've broken it up by men and women, and I was actually quite surprised with the results because the share of people that want to be 10s is very high. I was picturing maybe men will say they want to be 10s and women say they want to be 8s because I'm explicitly warning them about the bad parts of it. And yet it just seems like the normal desire is to be as attractive as possible.
I'm surprised at the result that I would have thought people would have been maybe social desirability would have or sour grapes. They would have
also yes, but it's a very strong result. You could say it's just my followers are selected for this, but it got a lot of attention. I don't think that it's so odd. Yeah. So to me, this is really one of the best arguments against sexual harassment law because what does sexual harassment law do?
Yeah,
it basically just tries to effectively turn your attractiveness dial down to something mediocre or lower. So that, yes, on the one hand, you no longer have to experience the bad parts of being attractive, but you also no longer get the good parts of being attractive. And yet people's stated preference is they would rather get the package of being good looking than get the package of being bad looking.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. There is there have been books written about affirmative action for the unattractive. So there is that sort of makes more sense than making the world more comfortable for the attract. Now it's not that simple. Like the more attractive you are, the more, because sometimes men will often go for who's sort of more available, maybe who's more in their sort of league, or like who just gives off an air of sort of being vulnerability, or who gives the air of sort of being
but even there, we have a lot of research from dating apps. Well, good-looking women just get tons of attention. I mean, almost all women get tons of attention, but good-looking women get a large multiple of what an average woman would get.
Yeah, I think,
and this is all in a context where men realize those women are getting tons of offers, and they try anyway.
And when you're talking about sort of social desirability bias, like civil rights law, which functions on that, it's there is no thought of like the difference in reality between an attractive woman or an unattractive woman, and an attractive man or a good-looking man. All right, it's always like women as a class face this, men as a class are doing this. whether a woman is advantage or disadvantage, I think it's probably, her attractive relative to the average male. I think her attractiveness is probably determines that. If you're, a woman at the 90th percentile of beauty, I mean, you've got it made. You never have to work. You can basically choose, you have a lot of options for who you spend your life with and where you live and what you end up doing. It's a good life. And yeah, these sort of categories of male, oppressor, female victim just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, the never's too strong, because I would remind you, like, you're not going to be this good looking forever. And if you get an unreliable guy, he may very well just dump you.
That's true. With technology now, women can stay, women can stay better looking for longer periods of time. You're right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Even still, like, my advice would be to find someone totally solid and dependable, and not just say, I'm so good looking, I can get anybody I want, because that's going to change.
Yeah.
All right. So I got two more questions for you. So one is expansive, and then one is a very specific follow-up question. So here's the expansive one. What is the Richard Hanania anti-wokeness agenda? Let's hear it here, so that anyone who ever has power to fix things can just do what you say.
Yeah, I mean, we need, we need basically, we need to get rid of the disparate impact doctrine one way or the other. We need to bring First Amendment law into the work environment. We need just like a general sort of drift towards freedom of association. So I do have I have a table in my book that goes into all the specifics of this. Just getting civil rights agenda in the public discourse is something that liberals do, and is related to this thing called wokeness that we all hate. I think is part of it. But yeah, I mean, the legal specifics are there. It's just about, you got to win election. I think it's sort of the battle has been sort of won on the American right almost. Maybe not prioritized as much as I want, but I think that any judge appointed by a Republican at this point is probably going to rule the way I like on most of these questions. And so it's a matter of, winning elections and electoral politics at that point.
So in a way, a lot of your message is fund the Federalist Society.
Well, I mean, fund whoever's running against for fund, you got to make, for the Federalist Society. But I think the Republicans are in bad. It's a different topic, but I think they're in bad electoral shape. I think who they selected these primaries. And they're going to nominate Trump every time for the rest of his life. I'm assuming. There's electoral difficulties for them, so they could be out of power for a while.
Yeah. So another good measure, actually, of how the left cares more about politics is this: if you want to be a Supreme Court justice, or just to have any kind of prestigious appointed judicialship, you clearly want to be right wing, because about half of those appointments go to right wing people, and yet lawyers are overwhelmingly left wing. So if you're just someone who wanted power, I would just say it's obvious you want to be right wing, and yet they remain very left wing. So it's like they would rather lose and not have the power, but remain true to the cause than to switch sides.
Well, it's I've seen an analysis of this. Like your odds of being a federal clerk, which is hard to do even at the best schools.
The odds of being a
federal clerk. So judges hire clerks, and that's the most prestigious thing, is to have a Supreme Court clerkship or a circuit court clerkship.
Sure.
And the odds of if you're a Federal Society member at Yale or Harvard are just very, very high for obvious reasons for what you're saying. The conservative movement has been good at vetting people. It's not like you could just show up one day and say I'm a member of the Federal Society. They have events and clubs, and you tend to have to know the people, and they'll suss you out if you're just a liberal undercover trying to get a federal clerkship. But yeah, I mean, people's beliefs don't
if
really...
you had some real determination, commitment, I think you could pull it off. It's
if you were completely...
just the number of people that are willing to live a lie for 20 years in order to get that job is shockingly low.
Well, I mean, if you're that Machiavellian, but most people are not. But then you'd have to worry about your parents and your extended family and your social circle. Are you going to lie to them too? Or are you going to tell them, hey, I'm pretending to be... I mean, that's a pretty weird way to live, right? And most people, aren't like that. So, yeah. I
mean, there's sort of this slogan of no more suitors, right? No more David suitors.
Exactly. There haven't been the Harriet Myers.
I mean, that guy didn't even pretend, right? He just.
I don't know about when he got confirmed. but he was just became a automatically like a conventional liberal judge, and after that, I mean, it was there were Bush Jr. tried it with Harriet Miers. If people remember this story, where like he tried to appoint some woman who was like the head of the Texas lottery or something, lottery commission or something, and people were like, well, "This person is not a federal, like doesn't have a record of legal scholarship," and conservatives revolted, and Bush, so much so that Bush pulled back, and actually, I think Alito ended up taking that spot. So yeah, there's been a there's the political polarization and sort of ideological sort of discipline on the right that there wasn't before.
Yeah, it is bizarre the extent to which it used to just be almost unanimous confirmation of every Supreme Court nominee.
Yeah. I mean, I think Scalia was unanimous or close to it. Ginsburg was. We were much less polarized. People, were willing to do that stuff.
Yep. All right. So here's my last question. Again, inspired by talking to some insiders. What do you think about the idea that a lot of employers actually secretly want vigorous enforcement of anti-white and anti-male discrimination law so they can overcome their internal resistance to meritocracy?
Their internal resistance? What do you mean?
So basically you're a CEO and you want to hire meritocratically so that you can run your business well and make money. But on the other hand, there's your HR people, compliance people, just like your young activist type employees who are not going to be happy if you do that. If you just say, well, this is what we're going to do in order to maximize profits, then they may all make life hard for you. But if you say, oh, no, due to the Supreme Court decisions, we don't really have any choice but to go and stop our DEI programs, poor us.
Yeah.
So I have definitely talked to people who actually are thrilled that the Supreme Court is going to make it possible for them to get sued because they actually plan to hardly ever get sued, but rather to use the threat of lawsuits as their way of, if not dismantling, at least pushing back a lot against what's been going on for the past 10 years.
Yeah, I think that what this gets at is that a lot of, you are basically, every institution is a sort of battlefield on these things. And what the law is and sort of what, the media is doing and whatever, those are sort of shaping, the battlefield, right? And so like, is any corporation going to come out and say, we believe in complete meritocracy and we don't care what the demographics are going to be? No, probably not. If, they could just, hire the best people and get ahead and not get in trouble for it and even say that their hands are tied, they would also take that.
Tied part.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's something there, and and then some people like argue against sort of my theories by saying, oh no, all the corporations are true believers and they'll just look at what they say, in the context of a world where civil rights law exists and all these, the media is what it is, and I believe in markets and I believe in processes. People, it'll weed out the stupider behavior.
And then they're just totally underrating how much intimidation is going on every day. People have internalized the fear so much that they're just really worried. All right. Sorry. What was that, Richard?
No. I mean, the idea of people afraid of what they say. I mean, I don't think like anyone who's been in even the media sort of portrayals of the corporate environment, that's real. I mean, you have to wonder where that came from. Americans are not known for being like a shy or sort of risk averse people in general. It's like, why are corporations like this, which are, otherwise, functioning well and productive and risk taking and sensible in a lot of ways. And I think, civil rights law just explains so much about the world.
Okay, Richard. So where can people buy the book and what's next for you?
They can buy it anywhere where you buy books. It was in Barnes and Noble's last. I don't know if it's still there, but it was there for a while. Amazon, available hardcover, Kindle, Audible, basically anywhere you can get books. What's next for me? I don't know. I might do some. I don't know. I might do some travel journalism. There's something that I've been.
Oh, you didn't like traveling?
No, I don't. But there's an opportunity. There is an opportunity that came up that I think it might be too good to pass up. I don't want to say it now because it's not sure going to happen. But I may do something like that. I don't have like a book planned. I think I'm going to write some essays on a few things and just sort of see where things got. I just started with an inside prediction, and so I have partnership with them and a lot of prediction market stuff and putting markets out there and getting people excited about prediction markets. But yeah, I'm just still doing this book, this book tour, and still open to what's going to happen next.
All right, I've just got to say, I really admire your self-promotion on Twitter for this book. I felt like I was already maxing out this kind of thing, but you have taught me new ways to self-promote. So,
well, thank you, Brian. Yeah.
All right. So thanks a lot for talking, Richard, and really looking forward to what comes next for you.
Yeah. Great talking to you too.
All right.